giác là cái tác đề link ấy, cái mã này nó là trên một, trên 2 là với cái font weight tức là bôi đen hoặc không ấy, thì đổi cái này thành normal này. Cái 3 là đổi cái khoảng cách giữa hai cái dòng này. Thì 3 cái challenge là như thế. Xong bây giờ là em lại challenge bên này.
If you prefer MDN or W3
Kết quả
Schools,
đổi khoảng cách
then
dùng
just
cái gì?
enter that as well.
Thêm break à?
Không phải. Cứ xem đi biết. Họ làm.
And the first thing we get is the color property, which sets the foreground color value of an element's text content. So that is pretty much what we want, right? And we can set it using this particular rule using the hex code that I provided. So let's head over to Atom, and inside our H1, let's set the color property to that hex code, which was 66BFBF. And we wanted to do the same for our H2. And for our H3, we wanted the color property to be set as 11999E. So now let's hit save, and we can already see the previews of our colors, which is roughly what I expected. So now if we head back to our website, hit refresh, our website is starting to look very, very nice now. And we've styled some of our titles to the colors that we were looking for. So the next one we were looking for was the font weight. So let's search for that and see what we get. All right, so we've actually got a property called the font weight, and you can see there's a whole bunch of ways that you can specify the weight. For example, the keyword values or the actually numeric values. So in our case, we actually wanted the keyword normal simply in order to get rid of this bolding here and to de-emphasize this subtitle. So let's head over to the H2 and let's go ahead and add our font weight over here. And we wanted to set it to normal. So hit save, hit refresh, and there we go. Now it's a little bit lighter in its weight and it looks just a little bit more together. And we've gotten rid of that pre-specified font weight, which was determined by our browser, where it set it to bold. So now the next one is the line height. So let's go ahead and set our line height for our H1 over here. So line height, we can specify it using a number. So 1 would be the default and 2 would be double height. Now, the important thing to remember about line height is that the preferred way of specifying line height is to give a single value without any units. And in our case, we're going to change it to 2. So let's hit save and let's see what that looks like. So that will increase the space between whatever is on top of the text of the H1 here and whatever is below it. Now, in my case, I don't actually really like the way that looks, but if this more spaced out look is what you like, then feel free to keep it this way. But I'm actually going to get rid of this after we've shown exactly how it works. Now, our website is coming along really nicely, and feel free to tweak around the layout or the positioning of any of the elements that you see on our front page here and make it look the way that you want it to. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to learn about the final positioning system, which is floating. And we're going to use what we learn in order to position our skills blocks to make it look much nicer than the way it looks right now. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, we're getting really, really close to the end result now, and all we need to do is start getting our skills section laid out in a way that looks a little bit better than this. So the first thing to notice is that if I switch on pesticide, you can see that we've got the skill section, and inside the skill section there's 2 divs. And if you look in the code, then you'll see exactly the same structure here. So this div is the skills div, which contains 2 further divs, which are the skill rows. And if you prefer to visualize this a little bit easier by seeing which is the opening tag for the div and which one is the closing one, you can actually head into Atom and change your preferences in your editor section to show the indent guides. So now you can see that you've got these lines that show you which div matches with which closing element. Now, I actually prefer this off just because I find it too cluttery, but it all depends on how you wish to visualize it. But the important thing is that we've got these 2 divs that represent 2 skill rows. And I want you to make each skill row have only 50% the width of the screen. So At the moment, it's 100% because it's a block element, but I want you to change that to make it only 50%. So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so this shouldn't be too hard. If we head into our styles.css and we go ahead and add our skill row, and just make sure that you check to see if you've got any typos between the way it's named here in the class attribute and the way that you've targeted it over here. So we want to change the width to 50%. And we can hit save and refresh, and you can see that even though our width for the div is now 50%, because it's no longer 100%, it's no longer centered in the middle of our website. So how can we fix this? We've seen this before, and as a challenge, I want you to restore this skill row to the center of the web page. So pause the video and see if you can figure out how to do that. So as we've seen before, the way that we achieve this is by setting the margin to be auto on the left and on the right. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can set the margin for this skill row to be auto, and that just means auto on all four sides, which will center it if we refresh our web page. Now, at the moment, that div is a little bit too close to the top heading and to the next div. So how can you change the margin property so that we end up with a 100 pixel margin at the top and a 100 pixel margin at the bottom, but keeping this margin auto on the left and right? Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this goes back to the circle shorthand. So if we start from the top, as we always do, we're going to add a 100 pixel margin at the top. Next, we come clockwise to the right, which we want to keep as auto. Next, we go down to the bottom, which we said, again, we want 100 pixels margin. And finally, we have the left, which we are going to set as auto. So the left and the right are auto, the top and the bottom are 100 pixels. Let's hit save and let's refresh, and we can see that margin now in action. Now, the next thing that I want you to do is I want this text, both the part for the design and development, as well as the description text, to be left aligned. So can you figure out which property you need to change and where in order to make that happen? So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so all we need to do is to go into the skill row and change the text align property. Remember, we changed this previously to make the text center aligned for most of the body, and that in itself aligned the images to be centered as well as all of our text. But in this skill row here, we want the text to be left aligned. So we can change that value to left, and that will override the center text align in the body. So now if we hit refresh, you can see that our text inside the skill section is now left aligned, but outside of it, it's still center aligned. Now, the next thing I want to do is to make the paragraphs of the text in here a little bit more spaced apart by changing the line height. So can you double the line height by changing the line height property? So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so in this case, we're again going to be inside the skill row, and we're changing the line height property to 2. And remember, in this case, we don't actually have any units, and we're simply specifying a scale. Let's hit refresh, and you can see that our text is now a lot more spaced out and much easier to read. Now, the last thing I want to do before we look into the positioning of our skill row is we need this image to be a lot smaller. So go ahead and change the width of the image to 25%. All right, so in order to target the image, we need to specify their class names. So one is called code-image and one is called chili-image. Now, this is just the classes that I've added for my own images. You might have named these classes differently because you might have different images. Just check what you have as your class name before you start implementing this and make sure that it works. So I'm going to cluster that with the other images, and the first one is called code-image. And I want to change the width to 25% of its parent. And the next one is the chili image. And this again is going to have a width of 25%. Let's hit save and let's refresh. And you can see that they are now the same size, even though they weren't before, because they're now scaled down based on the width of their parent, which in this case is actually the skill row. So it's now a quarter the width of the skill row, which itself is only 50% the width of the entire page. So now comes the really interesting thing. How can I make my text wrap around my image? So I want this skill row to be a lot stouter, so less in height, and I want this image to be on the left, but I want my text to be on the right of the image and wrapping around the image as necessary. Well, this is where the topic of this lesson comes in, and that is, of course, floating. So we can make the image float to the left of the text and make the text wrap around it by simply changing one property, and that is the float property. So if we go into our code image and we change the float property to float left and we hit save, once we refresh, you'll see that our image is now on the left of our skill row and our text is now wrapping around the image in order to display both of these on the same line. Now, it looks a little bit odd having the text right up next to the image. So can you figure out a way of having 30 pixels of space between this text and this image? So pause the video and see if you can complete the challenge. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can think about padding or margin. In this case, in order to apply a margin to the text, it would be kind of difficult because they're completely separate at the moment. We've got an H3 and we've got a paragraph. Now, you could add a div to wrap them together and add a left margin to that div. But what's much easier is to simply add a margin right to our image. So let's head into our code and change the code image margin right property to 30 pixels. And once we refresh, you'll see that our image now has a bit of space between it and the text, because it's wrapping around and now it has less width to be displayed, it's actually taking up the full width of that div, and this looks a lot better than previously. Now, as a challenge, I want you to use the same principles of floating to make this image appear on the right over here, and for the text to wrap around that image and to have the same amount, so 30 pixels of space between the image and the text. So pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so pretty much the same principles here, but in this case, we're not floating left anymore because we want it to be on the right of the text. So in that case, we have to change the float property to right instead of left. And that will mean that the text will wrap around the image on the left. And then we just have to add in that margin left of 30 pixels on the image in order to get it to have the same amount of space as we had up here. So this is looking pretty sweet, and we're getting very, very close to our end result that we're looking for. Now, sometimes when you float an element, you might not want all of the text to be wrapped around it. So for example, say if we only wanted that title to wrap around this image and to be on the right of the image, then we can actually use another property to make sure that this text does not wrap and end up at the bottom over here below the image. And that property is called clear. So if I target the paragraph here, and let's give it a class, let's call it maybe code skill description. And I'm just going to copy and paste it down here. And if I use the clear property to clear its left side, then that prevents it from wrapping anything on the left. So let's go ahead and try that. Clear left, hit save, refresh. You can see that that paragraph is now pushed to below the image, which is floating. But that heading, that H3, is still wrapping around the image that's floated to the left. If you think about clear as almost like the anti-float, then that starts to make a little bit more sense. So we're saying that float this image to the left and all text will wrap around it on the right. But for this paragraph, we said to clear its left, which means make sure that that left margin is clear and not wrapped around anything. Then that basically prevents it from carrying out the default behavior. Now, as a challenge, can you make this paragraph appear below this image rather than wrapped around it? Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so it's exactly the same concept here. Now, let's go ahead and just give that paragraph a class. Let's call this chili skill description. And again, I'm going to copy it, save the file, and paste it down here. And of course, remember that dot in front because it's the class. And in this case, I still need to use clear, but I have to clear its right side in order to make sure it doesn't wrap around the image. Because you can see that if I tried the same thing and I cleared its left side, nothing changes because it's not wrapping anything on its left. But if I change this to right, then you'll see that it now appears below the image and it's prevented from wrapping the image that's floated to the right. Now, I'm actually going to go ahead and clear both of these CSS rules because I actually prefer the look that we had previously, and I'm going to get rid of these classes as well. And this is the final result that we want to keep. Now, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. Float is one of the most commonly used and abused CSS properties. The thing to remember is that it has a whole bunch of corner cases, and I recommend to only use float when really, really necessary, and only use it for what it's meant, which is wrapping text around a certain element. And don't use it for positioning. Instead, use what we learned about positioning, like relative or absolute positioning, or using the margin and the padding for the layout and the positioning of your website, and to leave the float property only for the cases of wrapping text. Then you will surely get into less trouble and less problems than if you try to use a float just as a sort of free-for-all layout property, which you see a lot of people mistakenly do. So we are really, really close to the end of this module. And in the next section, I've got a challenge for you to look at a specification of how we want the website to be finally laid out. And instead of me guiding you step by step through all the little properties that you need to change, I want you to figure out what you need to change in order to achieve the layout that I've specified. So in the next lesson, you'll see text instructions for you to complete the final big challenge and get this website looking beautiful. So for all of that, I will see you on the next lesson.
Ê, mấy cái này có thằng nào recall không vậy?
Có.
Hello.
Có.
Recall lại để coi mấy cái challenge. Tao lên tao coi tao lọt.
Mẹ, mấy cái trường đại học mà làm đề kiểu này có phải sướng không? Nhà thích nha. Thì mẹ làm đề này.
Mày thấy slide trường mình với cái trong web trường mình như thế nào mày đòi? Đòi hỏi điều gì?
Cái trang mẫu xong vứt đó. Gài thì như cứt.
Cái gọi nha. Cho tới cái slide mà lộn slide dạy học thấy mày luôn rồi. Lười vớ cái đó. Tao nổi ở trong web của trường mà decor như cứt á, trong khi mà trường công nghệ thông tin. Vớ á. Làm cho phải dễ hiểu hơn không? Mẹ.
Thì phải tắt mẹ luôn là nhầm. Nhầm.
Cái mức đó cả.
Hả?
Cái tắt luôn stream.
Tao định tắt cái tab đấy đi mà tắt luôn cái ấy rồi. Vào lại đi, vào lại đi. Mình đọc thì phải mình cũng quên à?
Đây.
All right, so in the last lesson, there was a PDF that you could download, which showed the end result of our website. And it shows how things would be laid out, what is the rough spacing between each of the elements, and how everything should look and feel. Now, I've also specified the hex codes for the colors that I'm using here, and I also showed you how you can go about getting hold of this button code. Now, in this lesson, I'm going to show you how I implemented this, adding in the rest of the CSS code that we need to achieve this look. Now, it might just be that your code, based on what you estimated visually, is a little bit different from what I'm going to type. That's not a problem at all. Now, you can either follow along with what I'm doing in the solution, or you can simply watch it just to see if you got the broad strokes right. For example, how did you implement the horizontal rule, or how did I get this bottom footer section to look like this? Now, it doesn't matter if your website looks similar to mine or not. In fact, I encourage you to personalize your website, but I want you to be able to achieve the layouts that I've specified. So after you're able to look at a specification like this, now I admit this is a very rough spec and I haven't given you the specific margins and paddings, etc. But it's a great skill as a web designer to be able to look at a sketched out layout or a mock-up and to be able to implement that in code inside your CSS and HTML. So let's get going, and feel free to follow along with me or just watch the solution video to see how to do something that you couldn't figure out. So the first thing that I'm going to change is that I'm going to change the body text color to a slightly off black, and that's the color I specified here, 40514E. So let's head over to our body and let's add that font color here. So that's going to be changing the color property, and it is 40514E, and that's this sort of dark grayish color that we're going to implement for the text inside our website. And that just makes it look a little bit more designed than previously, but it's still highly readable. So be careful about using really light grays when you're changing the body color, because if there's not enough contrast with the background color, then it can make it really difficult. Not just people with visual impairment, but even normal people, it'll be a strain on their eyes. So always go for something dark and high contrast. Now, the next thing that I want is to have a little bit more padding between the H2s and the text below them. So for example, I want just a bit more space between the hello and this bio, and also the my skills and the skills section. So let's head over to our H2 and add that padding bottom. And I'm going to add only about 10 pixels to achieve that. So you can see the effect is really subtle, but it helps to space things out a little bit. Now, the next thing I want is a bit of space between the middle section and the top section. So I'm going to add again 100 pixels of padding to the top and 100 pixels to the bottom to space it out between the middle, the top, and the bottom containers. But I don't want to add any further margin to the left and right. So I'm going to leave it as 0 so that it's stuck to the left and right sides of the viewport, which is the screen. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the shorthand where I say it's 100 pixels for the top and bottom and 0 for the left and right. So let's hit save and refresh. You can see we've now got a good bit of space between the top and bottom containers, and that looks a lot more natural than before. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I want to format this little bit of bio here so that it's less in width and you can have a few more lines rather than this long line that's quite hard to read. And so I can do that by changing its width. So if I go into my index.html and I already have this class for that paragraph, which is called intro. You might have called it something else, or you may or may not have this class. Just check to see what you called this class over here, and then we can target it inside our styles.css. And I'm just going to put it below the pro class. So it's called intro. And I'm going to change its width to only 30% of its parent container, which is, of course, the middle container. So let's hit refresh, and you can see it's now a lot less in width, and it's now taking up 3 lines, which is much easier to read rather than one long, big line. So, but the problem is now it's left aligned and it's no longer in the center of our web page, and that's because it's no longer edge to edge, and we now have to set the margin to auto in order to get it to be centered in the web page, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and add a margin property and just set it to auto on all 4 sides, and now you can see it's perfectly centered and it looks a lot nicer than before. So one of the things I added here was to make the line height double what it used to be, and that spaces out the text and makes it a lot easier to read. Now, I'd like to do that consistently across my website, so for the intro as well as the other parts of text. So instead of having that line height down in the skills row section, I'm actually going to cut that and add that to a paragraph level CSS rule. So I'm targeting all the paragraphs inside my website, and I'm changing all of their line heights to double the height that it used to be. And this makes it a lot more spaced out and a lot easier to read. Now, finally, I just want to adjust my clouds a little bit, just based on what I prefer it to look. So I'm going to change the top cloud to have 40 from the top rather than 300 to make it go up a little bit. And then I'm going to make the bottom cloud only have a left of 250, so make it go further to the left. All right, so that is pretty much the top sections done. Now, the next thing we need to look at is this horizontal rule. And at the moment, it's looking a little bit ugly. But as we did previously, we managed to get these little gray dots to show up as the horizontal rule, separating the sections instead. And that's what we want to do here also. So let's go ahead and target the horizontal rule. So remember, because it's a HTML element, we're going to put it with the other HTML elements. And we're going to first change the border so that it has a dotted style. And I'm going to change the color to a light gray, so an EAF6F6. And I want it to be 6 pixels in width. So let's refresh that. Now you can see that there's now 2 borders, one above and one below, and enclosing a 0 pixel height horizontal rule. So if we now go and set the border bottom to none, then we can get rid of that bottom border to only have a single line, which looks the way that we want it to. So the next thing is to change its width, and I want it to be a lot narrower than that. In fact, I want it only to be about maybe 4% of the width. And it's important to use percent here so that it scales when my website scales. And finally, I need to give it some margin because at the moment it's far too close to everything else. So I want it to have 100 pixels of margin top, 100 pixels margin bottom, and I want it to be centered in the middle. So we're going to go for that good old margin property, and we're going to say top and bottom should be 100 pixels and left and right should be auto, so that we keep this centered in the middle. And that is looking really, really nice. And I know it's a very, very light color, but it's fine because it doesn't need to be red. It's just there to visually separate some of our sections. Now, the next section that we get to is, of course, this contact me section. And the first thing I want to do is similar to this intro or bio bit of text, I need to make this contact me message a little bit less wide. So let's target that and change its width. So the contact message currently has a class called contact message. So let's go ahead and target that inside our CSS, so .contact message, and we're going to change its width. And I'm going to change it to just 40% in this case. And that will make it go onto 2 lines, but it will also make it go to the left. So let's change the margin so that we have 40 pixels from the top and 40 pixels from the bottom, but the left and right should be auto. Now, the shorthand way of specifying that is by using the 3-element circle rule. So that's 40 pixels from the top, auto for the left and right, and 60 pixels for the bottom. Again, if that confuses you at all, make sure you take a look at the MDN developer docs for the margin property. So hit save, and we've now got more margin here than here, and it's also spaced so that it's automatically centered in the middle. Now, the final thing in this section is, of course, changing that contact me button from this horrible, ugly looking thing to something that looks a little bit more like a real button. And as we mentioned in the challenge, we're going to use the CSS button generator website. So the text I'm going to change to contact me, all caps. The font family will leave as Arial for now. The font color is just going to be white. And the font size we're going to leave as 20 pixels as well. Now, we're not going to change anything in the box, but we are going to change the border, and specifically that's the border radius. I'm going to change it down to 8 so that it's a little bit more square looking rather than rounded. And it's not going to have a border, but it is going to have a gradient background. And the starting color for our gradient is going to be 11 CDD4, and the end color is going to be 11999E. And for our hover or rollover state, we're going to start the gradient at 30E3CB, and we're going to end at 2BC48D. All right, so now you can see that when you hover over it, it's a little bit lighter to shade of green. So that looks pretty nice to me. And this is the automatically generated CSS code based on all of those options that we've selected. And we can now just copy it wholesale and paste it into our CSS over here. Now, if you take a look at our anchor tag for our contact button, you can see it has a class of BTN. And that matches perfectly with the class that we get back from CSS3 buttons generator. And that means that it will be able to target it without a problem. Now, the only thing that I want to change here is I want to change the text so that it fits in with our font family that we've set for the entire website. So I'm going to change the font family from Arial to Montserrat. And now if we hit save and we go ahead and refresh our page, then you can see that we've got that beautiful button that we've implemented without very much work at all. All right, so now we're finally ready to tackle the bottom section, which is basically our footer that you'll see on most web pages. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to change its background color so that we can see the difference between the footer and the middle section. So find the bottom container and let's go ahead and change its background color to the color that we've been using for a while now, which is 66BFBF. And let's hit save and refresh. You can see we've now got this bottom section highlighted and separated from the rest of the content. Now, why is there this gap between the bottom of our page and the bottom of our footer? Well, the reason, if you inspect, is that you can scroll it all the way up to the top, and if you hover over that paragraph for the last copyright message, you can see that it's got a pretty large margin, 16 from the top and 16 from the bottom. And remember, that came automatically from the user agent style sheet, which comes from the browser, and that's 1 EM top and 1 EM bottom. So we have to either get rid of that padding, or we can pad out our footer a little bit more and make it a little bit taller so that it encompasses that padding for the paragraph tag. I'll show you what I mean. So if we go into our bottom container and we change the padding to 50 pixels up top, 0 left and right, and 20 pixels at the bottom, then that should be more than enough to cover the 16 pixels, which is the 1em padding for our paragraph. So if we hit refresh, you'll see now our footer goes all the way down to the bottom, and there is now enough space for that padding to be included inside the footer rather than outside the footer. So next, let's style our anchor tags. Currently, they're a little bit too squished up together and it's not looking very nice. So let's go ahead and target them by targeting all of the anchor tags. And let's first change the text color to what we have in the rest of our document. And the text color that I specified was 11999E. And let's add the property, of course. And let's hit save and refresh. You can see that we've now got a slightly lighter color than before, but it's still relatively readable against the background. Now, you can of course make that contrast more if you wish to, but I usually think that the text in the footer, you don't want it to distract from the main message, which is either contact me or whatever it is that you want to highlight to people. So I want to have that a little bit more muted. Now, let's make this text look a little bit more in line with the rest of our text. You can see that the anchor text is actually styled in a different font from the rest of our text. So we can change that to what we've got for the rest of our body, which is Montserrat, by just copying this line over here, or as you probably should to get more practice, just type it out. So let's update that, and we've got something that fits in with the overall look and feel of our website. And now all we need to do is just space them apart a little bit so that they can be easily distinguished from each other. So to do that, we're going to have to add a little bit of margin to it. And I'm going to add a 10 pixel top and bottom margin and a 20 pixel left and right margin to give it more space away from each other. And this way we can click on each one individually without having them all mushed together. Now, the final thing that I don't like about this look is that by default, all anchor tags have an underline that shows you that this is clickable. Now, I want to show that in a different way by changing the hover state. So I want to get rid of this underline. And I can do that by changing the text decoration, which, remember, the browser automatically makes it underlined for all anchor tags. And I'm going to change it to none. So now we update that, that's gone, and that looks a lot nicer, and it doesn't look like a 90s website anymore, right? So as we said, we want to show that these links are clickable by making it have a different color when I roll over it. So I can target that using the hover state of the anchor tag. And if you remember that we spoke about these pseudo classes a few lessons ago, and if you're confused about this at all, then be sure to check out those previous lessons on the CSS selectors. So for the hover state, instead of having a font color of 11999E, we instead want to have a EA F6, and that will just be a little bit lighter so that when we hover over it, it looks like it's definitely clickable, and that gives the user enough clues as to what to do with it. Now, the very, very final thing that I'm going to format is the copyright here, and I'm going to change its color to make it less assuming and also make it a little bit smaller. So let's go ahead and see what we used for that copyright message. We used the class copyright. So let's go into our styles.css, find the part where we have the text, and let's go ahead and select the copyright message and change its color to the same as we had for our anchor tag rollover state, which is EA F6. Hit refresh, you can see it's now this lovely light white color, and then we're going to make it a lot smaller. So we're going to change the font size to 0.75 rem, so that's 75% of 16 pixels, and it's now less important and it's taking up less space as well. Now, finally, I want to give it a little bit more padding from the top and the bottom, so I'm going to change its padding to maybe 20 pixels top and bottom and 0 pixels left and right so that it goes all the way to the end. And that way it's got a little bit more separation from the top, and this looks a lot nicer than before. So that's all the changes that I had to make in order to fully recreate our specification here. Now, if you had any problems such as implementing the buttons or changing the horizontal rules, then be sure to try and fix it using the solution. Now, at this stage, if you're happy with everything that we've spoken about, feel free to go ahead and completely change or personalize this website, change the color schemes, change the layouts to whatever it is that you prefer. But this is the live website, and And the next step is, of course, make it hosted on GitHub so that your personal site is live and you can share it with your friends and your family or show it to anybody who might want to employ you. So that's all for this section. But in this module, we learn a lot about CSS and styling and positioning and layout, changing the text, changing the colors, making text wrap around images, how to create hover states, and loads more. So if any of this is not apparent immediately, it might be worth reviewing some of the more difficult concepts, for example, the positioning and the difference between absolute and relative, or you can simply just go ahead and start creating a web design of your own fancy that you've designed pencil on paper and try to solve those problems by doing. So that's all from me in this lesson. I'll see you on the next lesson.
Trang này để tập thêm để luyện tập về HTML CSS.
Mic mày nhỏ rồi.
Alo.
Ờ,
Nè, nó bảo là nếu mà muốn luyện tập thêm HTML CSS thì có trang này, nó kiểu mấy trang tập code rồi. Thì nó với GitHub với lại mấy cái challenge để người làm. Thì tao sẽ cho vào trong cái study này. Hết rồi.
Hey guys, today it's
Hết CSS rồi đấy. Bootstrap nó phải đi.
để tao pause video hết video này.
Học Bootstrap nào.